Welcome. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth. Today we are bringing you a video on the translation of the Torah to English, a special translation, as we were looking for the most accurate translation of the original Torah scrolls, etc., into English. And we came across this website which states that this is the translation of the Torah to English, a special translation. Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament. Historians and theologians have long thought that the original Hebrew text of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was lost to time, but recently discovered ancient manuscripts in Ethiopia confirmed its existence. These manuscripts, along with the growing trend of English-speaking followers, motivated Rabbi Meir to translate the Torah into English in its entirety for the first time ever. Check out this article about how he did it. Mark Rooker's contribution to the translation of the Torah to English. Known as the King James Bible, the text of the Holy Scriptures was first translated from Hebrew and Aramaic to English in 1611. Okay, would this have been the original ancient, very old Tav Asheret, the Lishana Articus of Prayer, the language God spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden, and the men at the Tower of Babel spoke? Or is it a more modern Hebrew or Aramaic, as you have today? Apparently King James didn't like the Puritan Bible, so he demanded a new translation be made in English and authorised it to be read in the churches of England, i.e. the Church of England. Not as many KJVers or KJV only groups say it was authorised as the only version to be read worldwide. Known as the King James Bible, the text of the Holy Scriptures was first translated from Hebrew and Aramaic to English in 1611. However, a more literal translation would not be completed until 1782, when Mark A. Rooker's translation from Hebrew and Aramaic to English appeared. Despite Mark A. Rooker's translation, it wasn't until this century that we were able to understand how exactly the Tetragrammaton Yahweh is supposed to be pronounced by looking at 8th century BCE documents of priestly blessing. It took another 9 centuries after Mark Rooker's work before any translation at all was created specifically for Jewish audiences, which tells us that it is of utmost importance to know your audience before you translate anything, if you are translating something with such a long history and strong culture embedded within its pages. So we decided to look at some of these people mentioned in this article. We couldn't really find anything on Mark Rooker. Very small information on him. Continuing, it was in the 5th century CE that Rabbi Saadia Gaon started to take things one step further. Right from the 5th century going forward, he compiled translations from Greek, Syriac, and other languages so that Jews could read those translations too, even though he knew many couldn't read those languages themselves. Is it because they were dead languages? Old dead languages, no longer used? Not really sure. However, the most popular versions today comes from Collins Dictionaries, who has translated the entire project in collaboration with academics. They use rabbinic commentary and a multidisciplinary approach to better explain what these texts really mean. Torah translation finished 5 years after Abraham Benisch's death. For years it was thought that no English translation of the Old Testament had ever been created, but this is not true. Abraham Benisch a German Christian living at Cairo at the end of his life, was painstakingly working on a Hebrew to English translation of the 5 books he called Holy and Desirable. In 1784 he announced he finished his work. The English Bible Society published Abraham Benisch's translation in 1809, 1815 and 1821. His work influenced early Protestant translators like Mark A. and Mark Rooker, who started translating parts of the Hebrew Bible into English as early as 1800. This could be a typo here. It's probably saying Mark A. Rooker. So we decided to look at information on Abraham Benisch. Born in 1811, died around about 31st July 1878 in London. An English Hebraist, specialist in Jewish, Hebrew and Hebrew studies, Hebraic studies, editor and journalist. He wrote numerous works in the domain of Judaism, biblical studies, biography and travel, and during a period of nearly 40 years contributed weekly articles to the pages of the Jewish Chronicle. And here's his biography. He was born to Jewish parents at Dessau, Bohemia in 1811. He studied surgery in Prague about 1836, while a commentary on Ezekiel which he had written was being published with a view to preparing himself for a journey to Palestine. Together with his close friends and fellow students, Albert Lowy and Moritz Steinschneider, he founded in 1838 the Proto-Zionist secret society, Die Einheit. For some years he studied medicine at the University of Vienna, but abandoned the study before proceeding to a degree. He left Austria in 1841 to settle in England, where he devoted himself to Jewish journalism and literature, and so forth. He died at Hornsey on 31st July 1878. And there's some partial bibliography here and some references. And we found this article on him. Basically, same as that Wikipedia one, pretty much. Bibliography. Not a word changed as ordered by David Gershon Mendelsohn, who paid $50,000 for the translation. At the time of this article, it states, this week a more literal translation of the Torah will be published, complete with cross-references to traditional language versions and footnotes highlighting a variety of intriguing details about biblical interpretation. But it won't be in Hebrew, it's being released in English. Translated from ancient Aramaic. Okay, when it says ancient Aramaic, is it the original ancient, very old tongue, no longer spoken? Or is it a modern version? Probably a modern version, like modern Aramaic or Syriac and Greek. Sources using centuries-old Talmudic principles. You could see a debate happening in front of you, said David Gershon Mendelsohn, who paid $50,000 for the translation from Richard Elliot Friedman, Professor Emeritus at California's Pepperdine University. The book includes an introduction by Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel that explores how translation has affected Jewish texts throughout history and its importance to Jewish tradition. For Jews, even without accepting the Bible as the word, translating is necessary, he writes. Without translation, we would not know what was written in this text. Translation also allows people to read the Bible in their own words, he says. So we had a look for this Richard Elliot Friedman. Information on him, so we know who we were dealing with. Richard Elliot Friedman, born May 5th, 1946, is a biblical scholar and the Ann and J. Davis Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Georgia, USA. He was born in Rochester, New York, etc., etc. And here's the origin of the P and the D source. Friedman is of the view that the P source of the Bible was composed What's the P source? Is that priestly source? Because in the book of Q, in the margins, apparently they found initials. It's like P, S, E, D, something like that. Yeah, which means priest, evangelist, scribe, etc. There's also Y and E. Yeah, so it was like Yahwist and Elohimist. Friedman is of the view that the P source of the Bible was composed during the time of Hezekiah. P, for instance, emphasizes centralization of religion. One center, one altar, one tabernacle, one place of sacrifice. Who was the king who began centralization? King Hezekiah. According to Friedman and others who follow the theories of Julius Wellhausen, a German biblical scholar and Orientalist, regarding the formation of Israel's religion, P is the work of the Aaronid priesthood. They are the priests in authority at the central altar, not Moses, not Korah, nor any Levites. Only those descended from Aaron can be priests. Friedman then goes on to say P always speaks of two distinct groups, the priests and Levites. Who was the king who formalized the divisions between priests and Levites? King Hezekiah. Chronicles reports explicitly. Hezekiah assigned Hebrew, is it Hebrew there? The priests and Levites two divisions, each of them according to their duties as priests or Levites. 2 Chronicles 31:2. Friedman writes that the Aaronid priesthood that produced P had opponents, Levites, who saw Moses and not Aaron as their model. What was the most blatant reminder of Moses' power that was visible in Judah? The bronze serpent Nehushtan, in the biblical books of Kings. According to tradition stated explicitly in E, Moses had made it. It had the power to save people from snakebite. Who was the king who smashed the Nehushtan? Hezekiah. Friedman has also proposed that the prophet Jeremiah, working together with the scribe Baruch, was also the person that is the D source, the Deuteronomist, who rewrote the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. In his book, Who Wrote the Bible, he gives supporting evidence pointing towards this identification, and also notes that in the Talmud, Jeremiah was already seen as the author of the books of Kings, and so forth. And he talks about the Exodus. In 2017, his 2017 book, The Exodus, How It Happened, Why It Matters, Friedman argues that the Exodus involved only a few thousand of people who left Egypt during the reign of either Pharaoh Ramesses II or his son Pharaoh Merneptah. This group later merged with the Israelites, introducing the cult of Yahweh in Canaan, the national god of ancient Israel and Judah, together with the idea of monotheism or monolatry, possibly inspired by the religious reforms of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Once in Israel, Yahweh's cult supplanted the cult of the Canaanite god El, as in the words Eloi, Eloi, Eli, Elohim, 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 and the two gods became one and the same in Israelite religious mentality. This group of migrants would later form the tribe of Levi. The name Yahweh, according to Friedman, was probably inspired by the Shasu deity, YHW, or looks like Yahweh. Semitic speaking cattle nomads in the southern Levant from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age were the third intermediate period of Egypt. They were organized in clans under a tribal chieftain and were described as brigands. The Shasu deity, YHW or Yahweh, whose presence is attested by 2 Egyptian texts from the time of Pharaohs Amenhotep III, 14th century BCE, and Ramses II, 13th century BCE. Friedman also rejects the idea that Jewish monotheism was born during the Babylonian captivity. See Deutero-Isaiah. And argues that the concept of monotheism monolatry was present in the Israelite people since the 12th century BC, although for many centuries it met strong resistance from polytheistic sectors of Israel. The book has received positive blurbs from several biblical scholars and archaeologists like Thomas Romer, Carol Mayers, Thomas E. Levy, and from publications like Publishers Weekly, The Christian Century, and the Jewish Journal. And here is his writings and further references. And his external link, his personal website. So we found the information on all those people. The Torah in English, published in 1910 in 40 volumes. The translation of Torah, an ancient text of immense religious significance, is one of those books that has been translated into English numerous times. Though it is difficult to know when it was first translated, we do know that Jewish time marks its publication in 1910 as a historic event. What follows after the Jewish time is a history from creation up to our own day, with commentary and opinion about how this work has been received throughout history, and what that means for today's readers. What exactly are the Torah and its original language? One way to define it would be by contrasting it with other texts like the Bible or New Testament. In contrast to those other texts, the Torah contains no narrative translation of the Aramaic term. That is, there are no stories in it. Rather, according to rabbinic tradition, the entire substance of the Tanakh may be found within its pages. Translations, and there's a list of best online translators. This can make understanding or reading it tricky because everything else seems unnecessary. However, that is not so. From Abraham, Joshua, through all generations until now who have lived their lives according to these principles, there can be no Judaism without scripture. Translations. The translated version of the Torah was printed on vellum paper on handmade presses. Oxford University Press released a new translation of the Holy Bible to commemorate the 400th anniversary of their first translation. This new translation has been printed on vellum paper and made by hand on traditional printing presses in order to preserve some history and tradition. Oxford University Press claims that this translation includes every word of God's inspired biblical text, rendered as accurately as possible in contemporary language. As technology progressed throughout history, so did biblical translations from Greek 280 BC to Jewish versions 1500s, and then Hebrew language versions 1914. Now we are looking forward to getting more updates on how these Bible translations develop further over time, with more additions made by people all around the world. Location of the original Torah scrolls. The original scrolls of the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, are believed to have been written by Moses or someone closely associated with him. Well, the Jews actually admit, we found, that he didn't actually write the 5 books as claimed, but it's traditional for them to put a name to it, to any book. And some that have been attributed to him. They were handwritten in Hebrew language and edited until their final form around 1250 BC. These scrolls were translated from Hebrew to Greek over 2 centuries ago during a time of intellectual development throughout history. In 1492 CE, Christopher Columbus arrived on the shores of North America and discovered many Native American tribes who had never before seen a European person. Around that same time, Spanish and Portuguese monarchs ordered their subjects to convert to Christianity or be executed. As a result, thousands of Jews were taken from Spain and Portugal and forced to either convert or leave. They spread out across Europe. Frequently asked questions. Is there an accurate English translation of the Torah? No, there is not an accurate English translation of the Torah. There are Hebrew, Greek to English, and Latin to English translations from old manuscripts. What is the literal translation of the Torah? The Greek term translated as Torah is a term that generally refers to all of the 5 books of Moses. The Torah is almost sometimes called by its Latin name Pentateuch. I always thought that was Greek. Okay, it's Latin. Is Torah the same as Bible? No, they are not the same. The Old Testament is a section of the Bible that includes ancient stories and prophecies about what will happen in the future. Who actually wrote the Torah? The Jewish tradition in the Jewish time has held that Moses wrote the first 5 books of Moses, which were written in the original Jewish version. Well, as we said, the Jews actually admitted that they're attributed to Moses. He didn't actually write it, and they add names to any books. It's traditional, right? It's one of their traditions. So we found this website, the Torah.com, and we went to this section, the Genesis of creation, and it reads, God creates life in the heavens and the earth. The first 3 verses of the Bible explained by Dr. Lisbeth S. Fried. In Hebrew, Bereshit, in the Aramaic, Brita. And it reads, the opening verses of Genesis describing God's first acts of creation contain phrases that are difficult grammatically and lexically. Their meaning has long been debated by commentators, traditional and modern. The first verse reads, and here it is in Hebrew, the King James Version, KJV, translates the verse, in the beginning God created heavens and earth. This is also how the phrase is understood by R. Moses Emeritus, born around 1195, died around about 1270. The New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, however, renders the first 3 words as when God began to create. This is how the phrase is understood by Rashi, 1040 to 1105, and the Etz Hayim Torah and Commentary, Jewish Publishing Society. Neither of these translations is correct. Is it talking about the King James and the New Revised Standard Version? Possibly. Looks that way. Neither of these translations is correct. The verb, in Hebrew here, is a 3rd person masculine perfect verb. He created, and the subject is clearly God. However, the first word, in Hebrew, is in the construct state, i.e., for example, in the beginning, of which cannot be followed by a verb. Thus, the Hebrew syntax is problematic, and the literal translation, in the beginning of God created, would be gibberish. The phrase, in the beginning of, must be followed by a noun or nominal phrase. We see this construction several times in the Bible, for example, and these examples there, Jeremiah 26:1, from the Hebrew, translated in English. In the beginning of the reign of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, this word came from Yahweh. Similarly, Deuteronomy 18:4, here it is in Hebrew, and here it is in English. You shall also give him the first of your new grain, and wine and oil, and the first of the fleece of your sheep. Since grammatically a noun must follow a construct, Rashi interprets the verb bara, he created, as if it were the gerund baro, creating, for example, or i.e., reading in the beginning of God's creating the sky and earth. As a traditional sage, Rashi would not suggest that the Masoretic pointing is wrong, but indeed this vocalization does resolve the problem with the text. Verse 2 continues verse 1. Verse 1 is an introductory clause, and the rest of the sentence is in verse 2 in the Hebrew. In the opening phrase of this verse, the words translate as tohu and vohu. This is what Jordan Maxwell goes on about in one of his videos. The tohu and the vohu present their own problem. The KJV translates the phrase as unformed and void, while the NRSV and JPS prefer a formless void. These translations appear to follow that of the late 1st millennium BCE Septuagint Greek translation, which renders tohu and vohu as there is in the Greek. In English, invisible and unformed. Similarly, the Latin Vulgate, 5th century CE, it's a Christian era, has inanus et vacua, void and empty. This translation does not fit with the other biblical usage of the phrase, which appears in the book of Jeremiah 4:23. In the Hebrew, translated into the English. I saw the skies, and lo, it was tohu and vohu, into the skies, and they had no lights. I saw the mountains, and lo, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. I saw, and lo, there was no one at all, and all the birds of the air had fled. I saw, and lo, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before Yahweh, before his furious anger. Because, according to this Jordan Maxwell, Jeremiah had this vision from God, and he saw cities, etc., people, all happy, etc. And if for some reason, some unknown reason, or the wrath of God, whatever, it was totally destroyed. That was like, there was chaos before the order. Like, this is like before recreation, because apparently, this is according to Jordan Maxwell, it was all destroyed, and that's why in Genesis, Adam is told, go and procreate, replenish, etc., etc. Means do it again, do it over. Yeah, have a look at the related Jordan Maxwell video. He explains it. Yeah, so for some reason they upset God or Yahweh, so it was all destroyed before his fierce anger. Jeremiah has envisioned what the situation in Jerusalem would look like after the Babylonian destruction. Okay, this is what it's explaining here. It might be a little different to what Jordan Maxwell claimed. Jeremiah has envisioned what the situation in Jerusalem would look like after the Babylonian destruction. The earth was there, he looked on it. In fact, he was standing on it, but it was tohu and vohu. He looked at the sky, so thus there was a sky, but there was no light shining in it. There were no stars, no sun, no moon to cast light. He saw the mountains and the hills quaking and moving, thus there were mountains and hills, but there was no one there. Okay, so this must be before Adam and Eve or something like that, before God said, go forth and procreate and replenish, as Jordan Maxwell states in his video. The birds, animals and people had all fled. Okay, so there were people there, but they'd all fled. The fruitful land was dead, because it's talking about Jerusalem, isn't it? There were no trees, no flowers, no cities. The land and the skies were completely empty. This Jeremiah describes as tohu and vohu. That would be like, is that like chaos and disorder? Oh, sorry, chaos and order? Not really sure. This tohu and vohu do not mean unformed and void. Rather, they mean empty and completely unpopulated, barren of life. Therefore, in Genesis, when God begins this creative activity, the sky, the land, and the waters are all there, but empty of life. The earth had been empty of life. Moreover, grammatically, the opening verse is a dependent clause. The time expressed in the second verse actually precedes the time expressed in the first. This works with the grammar of the second verse. In biblical Hebrew, the verb preceding its subject expresses the normal narrative tense. When the subject precedes the verb, however, as in verse 2, the sentence must be translated by the pluperfect. Go look at that word, get it defined. We have no idea what that means. We could go and have a look at it, I suppose. Let's go. Pluperfect. What does that mean? Never heard of that word. Always good to define a word you don't understand, you come across, so you don't get any misunderstoods of it, right? Etymology, Middle English pluperfect, modification of late Latin plus quam perfectus, literally more than perfect. First known use 15th century, and the meaning defined at Seeds 1. Time traveller, first known use of pluperfect was in the 15th century. Usually called past perfect in English. It's a type of verb form generally treated as a grammatical tense in certain languages, referring to an action that occurred prior to an aforementioned time in the past. And there's plenty more definitions here. There are many examples of this. It is in the Hebrew. Genesis 6:4 in English. The Nephilim had been in the land in those days and also afterward. That is at the time described in verse 4, the Nephilim had already been in the land and had continued to be in the land while the activity described in the preceding verses 6:1-3 occurred similarly. Here's Hebrew, here it is in English. Genesis 6:8. Noah had found grace, acceptance in the eyes of Yahweh. That is, before or during the activity described in the first 7 verses of the chapter, Noah had been acceptable to God. Translating the opening sentence. Correspondingly, Genesis 1:2 must be translated by the pluperfect, or at least this should be amplified in the translation. This verse does not describe the beginning, but what had been before the beginning. So that's what Jordan Maxwell was talking about. Thus, the first 2 verses of Genesis must be translated. Here it is in Hebrew and in English. Genesis 1:1. At the beginning of God's creating the sky and earth, the earth had been empty and unpopulated. Darkness had been upon the face of the deep, and a wind from God had been swooping over the face of the waters. Okay, in your Good News Bible, it has the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and in the footnotes it has divine wind. So here it is saying wind from God had been swooping over the face of the waters. All of this describes the state of affairs before God began to act, doing his creating act, populating the heavens and the earth. Thus the story in Genesis 1 describes how God changes an empty earth, engulfed by an empty ocean, and turns it into sky, earth and seas, bursting with life. God's first creative act is to create light. Then God said, "Let there be light." As the chapter continues, God divides the light from the darkness, and further acts God populates the earth by creating grasses, trees and fruits. God then populates the sky by creating the sun, the moon and the stars to live in and move in it. He populates the waters with fish and marine life, and the air between the sky and the land he populates with birds. Finally, he populates the land itself with animals, and then with mankind. There's footnotes. You go to that website, you can click on this and look at the footnotes. Dr. Elizabeth S. Fried, put it here, is visiting scholar at the University of Michigan's Department of Middle East Studies. She holds a PhD in Hebrew and Judaism studies from New York University and another in psychology from University of Michigan, USA. We had a look for a certain person's books. We found quite a few of them, but they weren't the one of the Torah that we wanted to read. You can possibly read it online if you find it. If we find it, we'll let you know with another video, a part 2. So if you enjoyed this video, you found it very informative, and you feel you need to go find that Torah, of which David Gershon Mendelsohn paid $50,000 for that translation, the correct translation of it, then by all means look for it online. If we find it, we'll find a copy of it on sale somewhere and we buy it, we'll do a video exclusively on that. So again, if you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and then go tell all your friends, family, Christian friends, etc., those who want the real truth, the whole truth and nothing but that truth, and would like this information on the most correct translation of the Torah, then tell them about this video.